Hello, good morning. Welcome to this rather beautiful building. I have to say it's my first time in Gibraltar and certainly my first time here, and this is a splendid place in which to be having our seminar this morning about chaos. So welcome. Just as a sort of start, let me set the scene a bit. I'm Susanna Simons and I'm going to be moderating this morning's event. Yesterday, one of our musicians, Orphy, referred to the fact that we have a new word for chaos in the UK, Brexit. And he was right, of course, and we can see similar versions of chaos around the world. The very fact that the American government was forced to close for 3 months, the fact that we have looming trade wars here, there, and everywhere, and sadly my phone has now abandoned me, but the headline, as I will show you in the South China Post this morning, is Hong Kong's crisis needs to be diffused. Out of chaos comes economic woe. So all over the world we can see something's happening and there is chaos. And we, all of us, live in an unstable world. So we worry about the economic and the political impact and the commercial impact of all of us. So we've asked our speakers this morning to focus on that fact and to see how you get out of chaos, how you take advantage of it, and whether there are ways in which we can make the current unstable times work for us rather better than they do now, rather than existing in a state of near panic, as some people are doing. However, we're going to start with an introduction to the university from two members of its campus. That's Dr. Catherine Bachleda, who is the Vice Chancellor of the University of Gibraltar, and Dr. Darren Fa.
Thank you. Good morning. Actually, I'm not quite going to give an introduction to the university. I've actually got the really easy job this morning. First of all, I should say who I am. I'm Catherine Bachleda. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University, and it's really my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of all of the university team to this morning's seminar, Managing Chaos. I think in today's world, as has already been said, many of us have to deal with that uncertainty, that complexity, that volatility that makes up chaos almost on a daily basis. So I, for one, am certainly looking forward to getting some insight and some direction in terms of how to deal with that chaos. And as an institution, we're delighted to be supporting this initiative, if only in a small way, with today's seminar. Because the reality is, even though chaos may make us feel a little bit uneasy, out of chaos comes creativity. And that's very important in today's world, particularly for an education institution. So I'd just like to say welcome to today's seminar. And I'd like to very proudly introduce one of our own team members, Dr. Darren Fa, who's our Director of Academic Programs and Research, and he's going to kick off this morning's seminar. I hope you enjoy what, as I say, looks to be a very interesting, stimulating seminar. Welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. Following, I think, from the random nature of today's events, I'm going to talk to you about something that has absolutely nothing to do with what you're going to hear about afterwards. Okay? Because what I was asked to talk about very briefly is some of the chaos that I've been lucky enough to be dabbling with more than anything. And it's really the mathematical type of chaos. Good morning, sir. So, most of you will know this, and this is just sort of plagiarized out of the Oxford Dictionary, but this is the one that most of you, I think, will be talking about, which is really complete disorder and confusion. You know, the chaos in Hong Kong we were just talking about, etc. I'm going to be talking about this one. I'm going to be talking about chaos which emerges as part of a complex system, which makes it unpredictable. But it looks really very much like the first, and that's part of what's interesting about it. The other two are quite interesting, the formless matter supposed to have existed before the creation of the universe, and mythological basis of it, which is the first created being, from which the primeval deities came. And these are all interesting areas to talk about. But I'm interested in extinction. I'm actually a biologist, evolutionary biologist really, And it's the pathway to extinction that I'm interested in. Now, most of my work is actually done on things like endangered limpets. So I thought I'd pick an animal which is a bit more cute, which is this kakapo. But the same concept applies. And the reason I picked it is because there's a wonderful book by the insert gentleman there in the photograph, which unfortunately is no longer with us, Douglas Adams. And the book is called Last Chance to See. And he's going to visit all these endangered, sort of almost extinct species in the wild. And this animal is actually quite interesting. I mean, it's a large parrot, lives in New Zealand, well, in fact, in only a couple of scattered islands around New Zealand now. Has forgotten how to fly. Well, really, it's become flightless, but it doesn't realize it's forgotten how to fly, so sometimes it sort of runs up a tree and has about the aerodynamic capability of a brick. It doesn't actually realize, it doesn't have much stress in its life because it's lived on an island where there used to be no predators. So you can actually walk up to one and pick it up, and the animal is totally, pretty much sure after you finish with it, you're going to put it down again, which doesn't really work much in nature, but where it lived, it worked. But then we came along, and not just us, but the stuff we brought with us, particularly rats. And this animal has been collapsing in numbers, and there's only a few of them left on a couple of scattered islands. And spending millions trying to save it. This is another story to go into, but one of the other reasons why it's so difficult to save is because, well, I mean, okay, let me give you an example. This animal, when it decides to breed, male kakapos spend about 100 nights of the year deciding to find a female kakapo. And they go up on the hill somewhere, and they've got some nice valleys. The acoustics are important here, you'll know why. So they make like a little hole in the ground, and they start making a sound which sounds a bit like a deep bass woofer, like a boom, boom. You can't almost hear it, it's almost something that you feel. And it does this night after night after night, in the expectation that a female kakapo will actually come. Now, some scientists actually think that female kakapos are repulsed by this sound anyway. But one of the things that happens is that it's a very deep sound, as you know. And people like ourselves, we play the bass, and we love this sort of depth of feeling. But unlike those little speakers you put in your living room that gives you that directionality to sound, the problem with the bass is, well, very often you can't really hear where it's coming from. So let's put it this way. If there is a female kakapo around, and she does hear it, and she does decide she's not going to be repelled, and she hears the sound, but she doesn't know where it's coming from. So actually, them two getting together is very small odds. And then if they do come together, she will only mate if a particular tree is in fruit. Yeah, so you say, well, why make it so complicated? And it's complicated because if you live on an island and you actually reproduce quickly, you very quickly breed yourself out of existence. So you evolve over a long period of time complex mechanisms such as this in order to actually keep that rate of reproduction low. One of the ways that scientists are looking, say, well, let's look at how these rates of reproduction, is this something that can happen? I mean, this animal is not adapting quick enough. Can we look at what happens when we change the rate of adaptation? And what happens is the rate of reproduction. And this is a very standard thing. What happens, and essentially, you know, when a population starts, such a population reproducing is going up and eventually tends to find a plateau based on resources that are around and competition between itself and other animals and blah, blah, blah. If it's too high, it'll tend to overshoot. And that overshoot means that all of a sudden you're really low on everything, things start to die, you start really competing heavily, and then you drop down really quickly, which is called a collapse. And then if you survive, you'll possibly overshoot again, and you start doing this kind of thing. There's an interesting book called Civilization by Jared Diamond. mentions how things like the islanders on Easter Island, he postulates the theory that this overshoot and collapse has actually led to the disappearance of civilizations such as this. Now, forget about the math at the top, but, and I'm going to mention this man, Bob May, wonderful, incredible, primarily an economist that moved into ecology, and that weird graph thing in the back is what you do when you get a really simple equation, which is that one at the top, and all it means is that you put in a number, your reproductive rate, and how big your population is, which is that X, and whatever comes out, which is after a year, you put it back in again, and you just sort of loop it, so every year, however many survive, it goes back in, and for a lot of the time, you know, maybe up over here, your population is steady. This is that steady state we were talking about with the kakapo. But if you ratchet it up a little bit, then you get into the overshoot and collapse, which is where that sort of like tree becomes 2, and you start getting this up, down, up, down, up, down. But if you ratchet it a bit more, it quickly becomes 4, 8, and then it enters that really fuzzy grape thing at the end of the graph. And that is what's known as chaos. And what it is that there's no predictability in that area. There's no way of knowing where you're going to come out next based on what you're putting in. And it is a really very, very interesting area, and the first person that mentioned it is this gentleman, again sadly passed now, Edward Lorenz. And it's the reason why I can tell you what the tides are going to be like in 5 years' time today, but I can't tell you what the weather's going to be like 5 weeks from now. Because these are systems, that chaos area, which are very sensitive. The reason he picked it up is he was running some models, because this is what these are, models, ways of understanding the world, and he was running one of them, and he says, I want to rerun it again. But rather than start it from the very beginning, I'll start it halfway. It's not going to change anyway. So he put it in the numbers, and he saw that after a little bit of time, these two things which were together started to separate, and before long they were just doing completely different things. And it was 4 decimal places out, that's all it was. He just rounded up the numbers slightly. And what he realized is that these systems are very sensitive to the initial conditions. That's what then became known, you've probably seen it before, as the butterfly effect. That notion, now, originally it was a seagull and it became a butterfly, but it doesn't really matter. The whole point is, and it doesn't mean that every time a butterfly beats its wings you get a storm. But these systems are very sensitive to where you start them off. And the final outcome, it could be completely different, even with a tiny, minute change. And what comes out of it is something that looks completely indistinguishable from noise, which is the typical chaos. But ultimately, there is a difference. The difference is that the reason we can't tell the weather 5 weeks from now is not because we don't know how the weather works. We just don't have enough information. The sensitivity, the number of decimal points isn't there. This gentleman, which is a French mathematician, was talking about the 3-body effect. And let me give you an example. He was saying, what variables do I need to calculate on a billiard table when I click one ball onto the other? So one ball onto the next one is cool, that's easy. But by the time you get to ball number 6, I'm having to take into account the gravitational pull of the person that's standing next to the table. By the time I get to knock on number 56, I have to consider every subatomic particle in the universe. So essentially, we can talk about futures, but we can't compute them. This unpredictability is inherent in all of the stuff that we do. This gentleman, Lorenz, I mean, one of the ones, and lots of people do it at home. You get a water wheel, you drop water onto it, and no matter how exactly, and you see how long it goes, and then it overshoots. And then it's slow, because it's not getting enough water, it slows down, and then it starts spinning the other direction. And no matter how much the same you start them, they will after time start together, but then start to separate out. All of them do this. However, if we get that, which is indistinguishable from the noise of real chaos, if you want to put it that way, but if you then go and you plot those values in a, and I won't go into the math, but it's a three-dimensional space. This thing that looks like noise ends up looking like that. It's a beautiful, again, butterfly-shaped thing called a strange attractor. I love the name. But without going into the detail, it shows that within this noise, there is, apart from beauty, I think, there is real order. You just can't see it. So fundamentally, well, interesting thing about these strange attractors is that if you actually pick things and start them completely differently, if you look at this particular part of their background, they will actually all end up giving you the same shape. They will never exactly repeat. So one part will never exactly overlap the other one, but they will all end up giving you the same shape. So there is something there. So I suppose my point in a very quick introduction here is that sometimes chaos is order and disorder, disorder and noise, but sometimes it's order which is masquerading as noise. And that's the difficult one to actually pick out. Okay? So that's it. Thank you very much from me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the seminar.
What an absolutely fascinating way to start our morning, Dr. Fath. Thank you very much indeed for that. I have to say there are certain phrases I shall take away. Overshoot and collapse is something that I think one might apply to all sorts of areas of life. Anyway, we are now going to move on to the presentations by the rest of our panel for this morning, and we're going to start off with Andreas Baneth. Andreas is a Eurocrat and a strategic communications expert. He spent 7 years on and off at the European Court of Justice and at the European Parliament, so he's an expert on that most mysterious of things, European decision-making, and he's going to come and talk to us about managing our way out of chaos. Andras.
Can I have the clicker?
Oh, the clicker.
I'm looking for the clicker.
Here.
Oh, there. Great. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. And yes, when you talk about the EU, though it be madness, there is system to it. And that system is changing. And it may seem chaos, but there is some order. But today, I want to talk about something different and something from another perspective of managing chaos. I was very happy when I got the invitation to address this topic. It's not something I thought about in such a structured way, and I was happy to be looking into it from a more analytical perspective and trying to bring some value to you of how I see the topic of managing chaos. I remember a night in December about 2 years ago. I was in Brussels. It snowed outside, which is pretty uncommon for that part of Europe. And I woke up at 3 a.m. with a heartbeat of 140. I was sweating, and this wave of anxiety washed over me. It was awful. It was only after several weeks, perhaps even months, that I realized that I was in the middle of a burnout. And it's not a pleasant feeling. It's overwhelming and disheartening. But when I look at the topic of chaos, I understood that one of the main reasons why that burnout came about was because my life was in chaos. And as I was preparing for this talk, I tried to think about it in a more structured manner. And I did ask myself, what actually is chaos? We saw some definitions in the previous presentation, but I'd like to take a more personal view on that. And chaos for me is a subjective feeling. It's an interpretation of the world, of ourselves, perhaps. It's a feeling that we lack the ability to control the world around us, perhaps to control ourselves or our emotions. It's also the uncertainty of the destination we're going to. And you might go on a hiking ride and not know where you're going to end up. That's perfectly fine. But it does include a fear of the unknown. It's not endorsing the unknown, it's the fear that I don't know where I'm going, I don't know where I'm headed, and I lack the ability to put that under my own control. So it's a form of disorder in our lives, and perhaps in our company, in our world, in our country, in our broader environment. What's the alternative of chaos? Alternative is trust, is a strong, deeply held belief that this is going to work out. It's control, that we can bring in a system, a process, to put this all under control. And a certain level of order is the other side of chaos. And letting go of a fear of this unknown. And all of this, once you have this in place, that's when you feel that chaos may not overwhelm you, but you can endorse it. A few years ago, I lived in the beautiful city and country of Luxembourg. Now, Luxembourg is the place where the tram goes on time, the streets are clean, everything works as it should. The big problem there is that this is boring, right? If everything is perfect, that often leads to boredom. And this is a big problem in Luxembourg. They've done great initiatives to counter that. But still, it's everything but chaotic. So I did ask myself the question, can chaos be a force for good? And I think the answer is yes. Chaos is not inherently, not necessarily, a negative force or a negative phenomenon. Now let me give you a quote from a Hungarian drama writer. He lived 150 years ago. He wrote this beautiful piece called The Tragedy of Man. It's a pretty well-known drama, at least in Hungary, not so much beyond the borders of the country. But there's a quote in which Lucifer, who is the devil, and talks to humankind and says, I want struggle, I want disharmony, to yield new powers to birth a new world. And that's where chaos can be something positive, something that gets you to act. And sometimes you need a crisis to even realize that there is chaos. Often we're in the middle of it and we don't know. There needs to be some form of a realization that chaos is there. And the crisis is not just there to realize that there is chaos, but it has to be a trigger to start change. And I think we cannot talk about managing chaos without talking about change. And change can affect you in your personal life, in your corporate life, all over. So change, to bring a tiny bit of science there, there's a process to it, just like everything else in life. And this is the change cycle, a pretty simple view or analysis of how change happens. But perhaps the most difficult part is the pre-contemplation, when we don't even know we need to change, when we don't even know that there is a crisis and there is a chaos. And once you get started, that you contemplate that something needs to change, something needs to be done differently, then you can prepare, you can act, you can maintain. Sure, you will relapse. Organizations relapse, individuals relapse. And hopefully you can jump that pre-contemplation again and keep the cycle going. There's a pretty famous book these days. It's been sold in millions of copies by a Canadian psychologist, Jordan Peterson, called 12 Rules of Life. And I remember this book because the subtitle is An Antidote to Chaos. There seems to be this overwhelming feeling that there is chaos in the world and we need to do something about it. So in one way, this is a self-help book. And the fact that it's so popular, I think, tells a lot about our times and perhaps ties into the very idea of today's conference. But I think the most important aspect is to understand that we need to fix ourselves before we try to fix the world. And how do we do that? Well, it's difficult. If you ask an audience, perhaps I ask you, who wants change? Hands up. For the better, in your life, in your business, in your country. I guess we all do, because change is understood as a positive force forward. But the difficult question is, who wants to change? And I don't dare to ask you about that. But that's definitely more difficult. It's more difficult because the way change happens is very nicely described by this chart. This is from another psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, who came up with this beautiful metaphor of the elephant, the rider, and the path, where we are the riders, the rational, the pragmatic, the fact-based, down-to-earth person who knows what needs to be done. But there's the elephant, the emotional self, those overwhelming, very deep feelings that we could tap into, and that can also derail us. And then there's the path, our work environment, our friends, our social networks, the narratives around us that shape the way we act. That's pretty much how the elephant, the rider, walks on that path. And to truly change, we need to talk to the elephant. I think a lot of people make the mistake knowing, I know what I need to do, but I'm not totally, fully invested in it, because they think the rider can direct that massive 500-kilo elephant. And most often, it's very difficult. So the two have to be in sync. And to be in sync and perhaps managing the internal chaos, I've learned a lot about individual psychology and emotional intelligence, and those things that these days are more often talked about even in the workplace, even in professional settings, of how to be more self-aware of what's happening around us, the way we talk to our employees, our spouses, and people around us. Self-love, positive selfishness, very strange concept. Selfishness is negative. All kids, I teach my kids not to be selfish, share stuff. But there has to be a certain level of self-respect and self-love to a healthy degree, because that will lead to self-esteem, a higher, healthy self-esteem, and perhaps even empathy towards others. And then setting boundaries, which is another concept not much talked about, but the power or the ability of saying no. Just as important in personal as much as in professional settings, of letting go of that shiny new project, that investment, that startup, the person I want to hire, and just saying, no, not this time. Because that's what helps us keep all the rest and keep our focus. And often we need to swallow our pride and ask for help, whether it's from a coach, a therapist, a friend, a religious person, whoever it may be, but not to walk that road alone. And also swallow the pride and tell others what you might be going through. It's fascinating when I started talking about the burnout and everything that came with it with some of my trusted friends, how much they opened up and says, hey, I've been there. I've had my struggles. I've had my difficulties. We just don't talk about that. And once they do, you suddenly feel less alone. You suddenly feel a deeper connection, a better friendship, a better way of living and coping, and perhaps even improving. But if you manage to get to a certain level and manage your internal chaos, you probably want to manage your external chaos in your organization, company, association. And just one or perhaps two or three ideas what you could do. Those of you who deal with software development would be very familiar with the concept of agile. Others may be less so. But agile is a way of working on projects where you list all the things you want to do. In software, all the features you want to develop, all the bugs you want to fix. But take that analogy for your non-IT related projects and say, here are all the things I want to do, all the things, all the projects that I'd like to engage in. Prioritize those. Work in 1 week or 2 week sprints. It's a nice concept because sprinting is going fast, stopping, catching your breath, and going again. And cutting it up into bite-sized chunks, prioritizing, executing. And then in the end, you look back at that 1 week or 2 weeks and say, what went right? What did we do the way we planned to do that? And how can we look forward? How can we improve communication? Were there any conflicts? How can we just make a better 2 weeks and execute better? this helps you focus. This helps you streamline no matter which business you're in. No matter whether it's your private life or business life, don't try to multitask. It's not going to work. And strategic work versus busy work is where the biggest dilemma is these days. It's very easy to keep busy and be very operational, but where is the strategic value? Otherwise, you end up in chaos. You'll end up in a mess. Use checklists. There's this beautiful book called the Checklist Manifesto. And some of you might know it, written by a doctor, giving ample examples. It's not just in the airplane's cockpits, but also in medical settings where processes help avoid bad decisions. And then, I know I'm turning into a book club, but yet another book from which this quote is taken called The E-Myth. It's mostly for small businesses, those who love what they do, and they start a business. It's based on a beautiful story of a baker who loves, or a lady who loves to do cookies. So she opens a cookie shop. And after a couple of months, she's completely burned out and about to close the business because she didn't honor this key principle of working on her business instead of working in the business. And you can do both for a while, but it's going to lead to chaos. And then, if you get these little bits and pieces right, hopefully there will be success. And from the outside, success always looks like that linear, easy, and straightforward path that you started, and you were an overnight success. But what it really looks like is messy. You fail, you make bad investments, bad decisions. But as long as the trend is going to the right direction, as long as you're aware of what you're doing, you know where you're headed, hopefully that line will be an upward trend. So the final slide I want to leave you with is from a guy named Seth Godin. He's this marketing guru, very, not just smart, but perhaps even wise guy. And he wrote this book called The Dip. And I thought it's a good closing part where most change happens the way you see on the chart. We are at point A. We think we're okay, perhaps not okay. We feel we need to do something different. We need to embark on a road, and we want to get to C. We want to improve. We want to go somewhere up. The bad news is that that road goes through that point B. That's a really scary place to be, because once you embark on a change, whether you restructure your business, you restructure your relationships, no matter what you're talking about, all of this will lead to that point B where you're worse off where you were when you started. But your goal is to get to that higher level, because only then can you truly embark on a good path and manage chaos. So that's my take. Thank you very much, and we can discuss afterwards in the panel.
Thank you. I have to say, as a working mother, I might take issue with the idea that multitasking is a myth, but we can discuss that later, because, as Andras said, there will be a chance to ask questions once we've had a coffee break. So now we're going to hear from John Ledru. Interestingly, I suspect there might be some synergies between some of these things, because John was a software engineer and spent his life in IT, having left school at a ridiculously early age, and discovered that the solutions to his own personal chaos came through technology. So whether that's part of what he's going to talk to us about this morning, I'm not sure, but I know that's how he found salvation and turned himself into the strategist that he is now. So, John.
But then I got thinking about the last couple of years and the journey that I've been on in that time. The people I've met, the people I've connected with, the people I've loved. And I realized that, yeah, I know nothing about getting out of chaos, but I know a lot about living in it. And I'm not so sure I want out. So in March 2017, my life was turned upside down. I fell well and truly into chaos. I'm sat on my sofa in my home in Manchester, and my partner of 13 years has just told me she wants to leave me. I knew the relationship had been struggling, but I was blind to the reality. It completely threw me. I was still very much in love and thrown between the feeling of complete loss for this relationship and the panic of what the hell happens now. We'd been together since I was 20, and as we grew up, we also grew apart. It seemed like everything was collapsing, not just the relationship, but my entire identity. I realized that I'd become a we before I knew who me was. And without that we, who the hell was I? So, trapped in a crisis of identity, I tried to recreate myself. I wanted to transform myself to be anyone else, just not the broken person that I felt I was. Just before we separated, I'd taken a decision. I'd been working in largely technical roles for the previous 18 years nearly. And I wanted to reorient my work, so I was working with people first. I mean, I'd always worked with people, but my roles were frequently oriented around technology. So I took the decision. I left my technically focused contract and started to try and rebrand. And then that happened. So then I'm unemployed, broke, newly single, abandoned, and alone. And I felt like a protagonist in my own sci-fi cliche. So I did what anyone would do in that situation. I accepted a speaking gig in Detroit. So I was also going to be running a workshop, but I wasn't known at all, so I got a total of no places booked in my workshop. And I ended up with 2 days to myself. So I decided to head out into Detroit and explore the city with my camera, which at the time was exactly what I needed. I'd never visited Detroit before, but the city felt like it was rising from the ashes. Detroit is a city with huge problems. These are problems that have been with them for more than half a century now. But it's full of hope. The people are so full of hope. On the last day, I'd been exploring downtown Detroit. And in my excitement to leave in the morning, I managed to leave my bag. So it got to the end of the day, and my battery has run out in my camera, and I realized I don't have my wallet, and I didn't have any money for a taxi back to my apartment. It was about a 30-minute walk, so I start walking back from downtown up to my little midtown apartment. As I turn the corner, there's this man stood in front of me. He's filthy. He has a cut across his forehead and plastic bags wrapped around his bare feet. He looks right at me and sees my camera and says, "Hey, take a picture of me. I'm the real Detroit." I stopped and smiled and just said, "I'm really sorry. My the battery's dead. I can't." And I paused and thought for a moment and said, "Oh, and I left my wallet at home today. I don't have anything else I can give you. I'm sorry." He looked at me for a moment, and I looked back at him. And then he said something that you never really expect. He said, "Can I rap for you?" You definitely don't expect that. Now, while I wasn't expecting that, I can tell you that I knew at that moment exactly what the correct answer to that question is in that situation. If you find yourself in it, the answer is yes, okay? So in this strangely intimate setting on the corner of a street in downtown Detroit, this man rapped for me. He told me his story. He told me how when you live with heroin addiction and you have no money, you're living with withdrawal all the time, hit to hit, desperate for relief. He told me how 2 nights before someone had kicked the shit out of him while he was sleeping. He doesn't know who it was, he just woke up with a boot in his face. He told me about his wife. He told me about his daughter. How he left them to protect her from the him he was becoming. How much he missed her. How much she loved her. When he finished, I hugged him and thanked him. We said goodbye, and I continued my walk up Cass Avenue. A moment later, behind me, I heard someone talking to him. "Did you get anything?" the voice said. Nah, my friend replied. "I told you, we're not going to get shit from people around here," the voice said. Nah, man. He listened to me. "It's been a long time since anyone listened to me," he said. I realized in that moment that if you don't give space to people, they will never surprise you. I'd given him, by accident, I think, just a little bit of space to be himself. As leaders, we need to give people the space to surprise us, the space to grow, the space to fuck up, and the space to recover. Our number one priority as leaders should be holding the space for the amazing people that we work with to be amazing. Early the following year, I was working in India. India is one of my favorite countries. Amazing people, amazing food, amazing food. While there, I was able to spend some time with a friend and colleague of mine, Linda Rising, and we discussed an experience she had many years before working with a team in Texas. She was doing a workshop for them for a couple of days, and one of the team members just wouldn't engage. He would literally sit in the corner of the room, he'd kind of make noises and be generally kind of passively disruptive. But whatever she did, he wouldn't engage. She actually said to him, look, you don't have to be here if you don't want to be. And he was like, no, I want to see what's going on. Okay, so he continued this throughout the day. Linda actually put on lunch for the whole group, and he had brought his own sandwiches in, and he sat in the corner of the room on his own, and again didn't connect with anyone. At the end of the day, she did an exercise called Showing Appreciations. This is an exercise where everyone sits in a circle and individuals will stand up and thank one another or thank the group for something that they've done over the time, let's say over the time of the project or the time of whatever the period is. So they might say, thank you so much for working with me last night. I really appreciate the time. And the receiver of that appreciation can either say thank you, or they can stay silent. What they can't do is just brush it off. I was just doing my job. Just. So the group were doing this activity. They sat in a big circle. Unpredictably, this man sat in the corner, just seeing what's going on. And then Linda notices that he's joined the circle. Now, he didn't do anything, and she didn't say anything, but he got up and he sat down and he joined the group. And then after some time, he stood up and he addressed the whole group and just said, thank you for putting up with me. This exercise and Linda had created the space for this person to surprise them, for this person to stop living up to the expectations of the group, to be authentic. People are chaotic, and chaos needs space. If you don't make space for the chaos in your life, you will never let anyone, or even yourself, surprise you. Much of the time, we offer up a performance to the expectations of others. It's not surprising for them. It's just what they expect. As leaders, I think this is about rethinking our position completely. Are we managing the people we work with, or even worse, the resources, or the space in which they are working? In fact, as leaders, do we need to manage at all? How much control do you really need? When a new person joins an organization, the management have expectations about that person. They're both how that person has sold themselves at the interview, but also just the cultural norms of the organization. How does your organization react to people that don't align to those cultural norms? These cultural norms are actually the psychological space in which people work. They define the boundaries, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And many leaders I've worked with just don't realize the implicit boundaries they are creating and how apparently unrelated boundaries might conflict with the goals of their organization. I was once working with a team in the UK, and the leadership there wanted to increase the autonomy of the team. They wanted the various engineering teams that they had to not have to ask the business so much. They wanted them to make decisions on their own. I asked the manager to give me some examples of what one of those decisions might potentially make or cost the organization. You know, what do you actually mean? Are they just deciding the color of a button on a website, or are they changing massive functionality? Well, you know, we're talking massive changes. These teams made business-critical software, and these changes could have cost or potentially made the business millions. I then threw him a curveball and said, did they have a dress code? I actually knew they did. And he was clearly slightly thrown and unsure of the relevance of the question, but he humored me, thankfully, and said, oh, yeah, we have a dress code, you know, just to keep things professional. I said, oh, okay. So you want your teams to make decisions valued in the millions, and you don't trust them to get dressed in the morning. This is an example of how we can have conflicting boundaries. Sometimes these policies, these things we have in our organization seem totally unrelated, but they could define the boundaries of the space that your people are working in. And maybe those boundaries, as a result, just aren't as clear as we might think they are. We need to make space for the chaotic people we work with. Space to let our amazing humans surprise us, to create space for serendipity. So last month, I returned to Detroit. And as I walked up Woodward Avenue, with a friend of mine, Facebook kindly reminded me that I'd actually been on that street exactly 2 years before. Only this time, I just delivered that very same workshop, and it had sold out. And needless to say, I'm far more certain of who I am today than I was 2 years ago. As we walked up the street, we found the Detroit Museum of Contemporary Art. For those of you that know the building, it's normally covered in amazing murals. And when I visited it 2 years before, it was painted in, funnily enough, pink and yellow stripes and other things. This time, as we were walking up to the building, it was actually all black. And I thought maybe they were between murals. Maybe it was, you know, they kind of put the base coat on to start again. But as we got closer, we realized there was a mural there. It was a simple message in white neon lights across the front of the building. It just read, "Everything is going to be all right." The famous lyrics from Bob Marley. So to finish, create space for your people. Let them fuck up so they can surprise you. Make space in your life for chaos, because out of chaos comes serendipity. And in a chaotic world full of chaotic humans, we can't have success without it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. Making space for your staff to enjoy a bit of serendipity and find out what it is they know and to be able to tell you what they know. I once did some work for the innovation unit at the DTI in the UK, and one of their descriptions of a really innovative company was one which listened in equal measure to its customers and its staff, and actually the moment of innovation was that cross, like a figure of 8 on its side. That bit where they crossed was the moment of supreme innovation because they listened to both sides in equal measure, and I think that's sort of what John was saying. Give space to your staff to enable them, and indeed the people that you're serving, enable them, and above all, listen. And now we're about to listen to our third speaker, who is Graham David, who has one of those names that you can get wrong. You can call him David Graham or Graham David, because I'm sure that happens to him all his life. Anyway, he started out as an actor, but now he uses that drama-based learning and those experiences as part of drama-based coaching. Graham.
So, before we get started, do you know everybody else here, by the way? Okay, I should explain, by the way, I ask a lot of questions, so at any stage you feel like joining in, that'd be helpful, because I will wait for the answer. So, my name's Graham. I'm going to be working with you for the next 15 minutes, and I was figuring, what could I talk about that I definitely know about, that I can try and offer you some help and some use that you could put into practice today, tomorrow, whenever. And one of the number one fears that people have is not flying or dying or snakes or spiders. The number one fear, apparently for most people, is public speaking. You're absolutely right. It's standing up and saying a few words. There are people in this room who statistically would rather die than stand up and say a few words. Although most of us have seen very senior people in our organisations manage to stand up and deliver a few words whilst dying. Most of us have seen this. So what I want to share with you in this session is some of the key lessons I've picked up from speaking publicly, and some of the chaos that happens when you speak publicly. There's always stuff that can go wrong. And interestingly, what I've discovered over the last 20 years, I think I've spoken in about 15 different countries, hundreds of organisations, thousands of people in the audience, and I've discovered that there's often a bunch of things that go wrong. But one of the interesting points is, can you make it so that it looks like everything's okay and it's working the right way when you're on stage? So that's what I'm going to share with you. Before we do that, I need you to get your devices or your phones or whatever you've got out, please. Right now, yeah, we are on a time-limited thing here. That'd be great, thank you. And I'm going to invite you, please, to take 2 selfies. So you can do this just by yourself, or this is a great opportunity to do this with somebody near you. So you could either find somebody you don't know, or somebody that looks quite interesting, or somebody you find sexually attractive. Now, here's what I want you to do, please. 2 selfies. The first selfie looking very smiley, thumbs up. Ah, yep, that's the one, yes. Find somebody else who has got one. This is an opportunity. 2 selfies. Selfie number 1 is smiling. Selfie number 1 is so number 2 is angry. Thumbs down. So 2 selfies. Quickly do that for me, please. Then I'll tell you what I want you to do with these. 2 selfies, just quickly, I'll give you 30 seconds for this. Okay. Good stuff. So you've got those 2 selfies. Excellent, good stuff, thank you. Now, here's what you to do. I'll come back to those selfies in just a moment. Let me show you these 5 key things that I've learned. Because one of the interesting things is when you talk to an audience, no matter where you work, audience types always fall into 3 different types of people. I'm not saying there's only 3 types of people in the world, but I'm saying that in an audience, you pretty much fall into one of these 3 types. Now, I don't know which of these 3 types you are, but let me tell you what these 3 types are and see if you can identify with any of these. So, the first type is what I like to call the enthusiast. I'll tell you a bit about them in a moment. The second type is what I call the vacationer. And then the third type is what we like to call the prisoner. So let me tell you about these 3 types. So the enthusiast is the person who comes along to a conference. They're busy. I know you're busy. You've got lots to do. But you think, I've got to be here. I could learn something from this. Being an enthusiast doesn't mean you agree with everything, by the way. You might often challenge or push back or whatever, but you want to engage with the message. You want to see what you can gather from it. Being a vacationer Vacation, you kind of one of those. You know, if it's something you're enjoying, you might switch on a little bit, and then you hear something you don't want to hear, and you switch off a little bit, and you kind of flip-flop between the two. And then you have the prisoner. And the prisoner is the person who turns a conference or a meeting or a briefing at work, and with every nerve and fibre in their being, lets me know that they don't want to be here. This is the person who sat with their arms folded, I know you're just comfortable, and they sat with their arms folded, glaring at me, letting me know that not only do they not approve of my message, they don't like me either. There's something wrong with my tie or my stupid photo exercise at the start. They just want to let me know that they're a little bit above this. Now, the interesting thing is, if you recognise these three types, and I think most of you probably do, you recognise you've been all of these three types at different times. Sometimes in the same meeting. It's possible to turn up as an enthusiast and think, oh, I should really be there, somebody very senior's talking, I should listen. And then there's 397 PowerPoint slides, delivered by somebody who is male, pale, and stale. And you find yourself plummeting down through vacationer to prisoner. You may have also found yourself occasionally turning up as a prisoner, and by the end you're thinking, that was all right. I got something from that. That was quite useful. So my first little piece of advice: when you are speaking to an audience, it's very easy to get drawn to some of those types. Which do you think are the people you most often look at when you are a speaker? What do you think is the audience type you most often think about? Say again? Enthusiast is the one we want to look at because they're nodding and smiling, so we like to end up talking. It becomes a love-in, which is not very good. Or the other person that news speakers often worry about, who do you reckon that would be? The prisoner, of course, because you keep thinking maybe if I keep looking at them and they keep glaring back at you, and it becomes stressful. So my number one piece of advice for news speakers is be an enthusiast. Treat everybody as though they're an enthusiast. Because some people just have those sort of faces. They're actually quite happy, but that's just how they look. Think about it. Most of us know in our lives and our networks at least one solid prisoner. You think of everybody you know at least one person right now who's always got a problem for every solution. You know? The person who lights up the room when they walk out. The math turns south. So my strong advice is, a great way to manage chaos is to treat everybody as though they are an enthusiast, even if they don't look like it, and to act as though you're an enthusiast. I don't know if you remember June 1999. I remember it quite clearly. I was just hired to speak to an audience, or a number of audiences, about sea life. I don't know a lot about sea life, but there was a script. I could learn it. This was all good. And whilst I was doing this, the person who hired me said, by the way, in between speaking about sea life, I want you to wear a particular uniform and be entertaining. So I said, great. What is the uniform I need to wear? He said, this one. I have a degree education. I've trained to be an actor. And I had to wear a blue fluffy shark uniform and walk around and wave at people. I said, great, okay, what's the script? He said, there is no script, you're not allowed to speak. So I said, okay, what do I do? He said, be entertaining. I want people talking about it. So I said, okay. So after about 10 minutes of walking around waving at children and posing for photos, and not speaking, of course, I was a little bit bored. So I started leaning against walls like this on a slight angle. And if you stand absolutely still in a big costume like that, nobody can see you breathing. And you look quite a lot like a big stuffed shark. And what happens is you can see them coming through the mouth, and you can see them running around and going, look, it's Sharky. And they all come running up to get to their photos taken. And what I would do was stand absolutely still, just as they raised the camera, just as the children came up to this, what they thought was a big soft toy. I'd wait absolutely still and then go, ah! And the children would go, ah! And the parents would throw the cameras up. So I remember getting called into my manager's office, who wanted a conversation about what I was doing. And I said, do you remember you told me you wanted me to be entertaining, and you told me to get people talking about it, right? And you know when people are trying to tell you off, but they're trying not to laugh at the same time? It was one of those moments. And he was trying to, but he kept smiling. Anyway, the point is this. Very often in life, certainly when you're speaking publicly, there are rules that are assumed, and there are rules that you are told. So you have to have PowerPoint, you have to have a lectern. I was chatting with John earlier on about how much we both hate lecterns. You've got to have a handheld mic. There's all these rules. But actually, sometimes the best thing you can do when speaking publicly is to make your own rules. And it's the same in life, generally. Because most people I've found, most organisations I've worked, everyone's waiting for somebody else to tell them what to do. Now, sometimes that's fine. That's what you have to do. But most often, nobody really knows what to do. So my strong advice is make your own rules. Most of the time, it'll be fine. Nothing will happen. Occasionally, something incredible will happen. It will be brilliant. Sometimes it will go wrong, and you will have a blue fluffy shark moment. But it's okay. I got fires, but hey, we move on. Life is like this sometimes. One of the questions that I get asked a lot is, when you're speaking publicly, is it okay to ask your audience questions? I think it's a fantastic idea. What do you think I like so much about asking an audience? This is a conference like this, a meeting or a briefing. What do you think are some of the skills or the values of asking questions? Give me some ideas. You get answers? Good. What else? You get involvement. Really good. What else? You do make people think? Yes. What else? If you haven't had a go yet, by the way, now's the time to pitch in. What else would be some of the benefits of asking an audience a question? Get to know people? And listening, yeah. You see, the great thing is, most of the time, we don't often get asked those questions. And it's a really good idea in a conference or a meeting or a briefing to ask some questions. You hear different voices, different perspectives, different views. It changes the dynamic. All of the benefits you've just explained there, some involvement, get people listening, different voices. It's fantastic. And so too in life, you know. The more you know, the older you get, the longer you're on this planet. I don't know about you, but I tend to think I know a load of stuff about stuff. And I tend to wade in with my opinion. And actually, it's a really good idea to ask them what their opinion is, because sometimes their opinion's really good. So ask more questions. Of course, if you ask questions, you've got to listen to the answers. So sometimes you've got to just wait, because just listening to the answer is powerful. And in a conference or a meeting or a briefing, one of the most powerful things you can do is to change the tempo and the mood and the pace. What I love about this technique is anyone can do it. You just need to stop talking. People stress about silence. They worry that somehow it's all going to go wrong. And no, it's not. You feel right now, don't you? There's a change in the atmosphere. It feels different. So allowing that silence, allowing that breathing point is really massively powerful. If you really want to go for this in your day-to-day life, when in meetings or briefings, you've asked something and they've given you an answer, when they finish speaking, don't say anything for at least 7 seconds. 7 seconds is a long time, right? But it's only this long. What do you think happens in that 7 seconds? They are thinking about what else they want to say. They will often add something. They'll often think about what they just said. You have an opportunity to consider what you've just said, and it can completely change the dynamic. By the way, if you're going to try the 7-second pause, don't do it like this. It's really weird and freaky. Okay, final point. The number one difficulty that many new speakers have is knowing how to finish. So you may have seen speakers do the whole thing where they go, well, that's kind of me. I think that's everything. Oh, another slide. Any questions? Oh, no questions, great. And it kind of rambles on. So I always say to new speakers, when you want to finish, say thank you and stop and leave it at that. That's it, because then people know to applaud. That's nice. It's nice to walk off to applause rather than a stunned silence. But also in normal life, day-to-day life, I thoroughly recommend an attitude of gratitude. I recommend trying to say thank you, or gracias, or grazie, or merci, or dankeschön, or shukran, or whatever's most appropriate to you. Because nobody in the world ever has been thanked too much. So if I ask you to think about the last time you were thanked by somebody at your work or your organisation, the answers I typically get are, I don't remember, or 1990, or even worse, who's my line manager? So find opportunities to thank people, find opportunities to recognise and appreciate your colleagues, your team members, your friends, your family. Because nobody in the history of the world ever went home to whoever's at home and went, God, what a day I've had. And what's the matter? Do you know what I've had today at work? No? What's happened? Do you know what I had from the first thing when I arrived to the last thing, and I stayed late? Do you know what I've had all day today? I've had thank yous. I've been appreciated, I've been recognised, I've had enough. I'm not staying there another day. It never happens. So, listen, as we wind this up, we get to these 5 key points, please start to be an enthusiast and treat other people as though they're enthusiasts. Make your own rules. Probably nothing bad will happen, occasionally something will, but that's all right. Ask more questions. You get that one yourself. And remember to get an attitude of gratitude, to start saying thank you. Now, before I give you my final thank you, and of course you know what to do at that stage, you will remember that I asked you to take 2 selfies. And if you are down with the social media, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, there's a couple of tags on the screen, and if you look on the back page, not just yet, but on the back page of the newspapers in those netty little bags you've got, you'll see some taglines for other social media. So it would be fantastic, and I'm only inviting you to do this, it would be fantastic if you posted the appropriate picture. Now, it's entirely up to you whether you go for the positive one or the negative one, but I will simply say that most people look better when they're smiling. But you pick whichever one's most appropriate for you. Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure and privilege working with you. I appreciate your engagement and your answers, but for now, thank you.
And I'll say one thing, he certainly follows his own rules, because that was an enthusiastic presentation. And I have to confess, I've got one of those faces. I do need to learn to smile more, because I'll be walking along the road feeling really fine, and somebody, usually a builder, will go, "Cheer up, love, it'll never happen." So I'm smiling away here as I tell you it's now time for coffee.